All right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another Nature Talks webinar with Nature Nova Scotia. So my name is Emma Bocking. I'm a volunteer with Nature Nova Scotia. And helping me is Rebecca Parker, Nature Nova Scotia's coordinator. And tonight we have with us Izzy Clarke with Coastal Action. So Coastal Action is a charitable organization on the south shore of Nova Scotia that believes in safeguarding a healthy environment for future generations. For over 25 years, Coastal Action's goal has been to promote the restoration and conservation of our environment through research, education, and action. Coastal Action works in 4 core areas: watersheds and water quality, species at risk and biodiversity, climate change and education, and coastal and marine. So Izzy is a senior climate change project technician at Coastal Action. So she'll be talking to us tonight about natural infrastructure. So Izzy has a Bachelor of Arts in Sustainability from Dalhousie University and a diploma in Natural Resources Environmental Technology from NSCC. Sorry, let's take a deep breath. Izzy has so many accomplishments. She's also a good friend of mine and loves plants of all kinds, gardening, houseplants, and edible plants. So if you're ever lucky enough to be out on a hike with Izzy, she'll teach you lots of things about the plants around her. So, Izzy, take it away.
I'm blushing. All right.
Excited to learn more.
Great. I'll just share my screen. All right. Can everybody see that? All right, so thank you for that really nice introduction, Emma. I'm going to try to keep my blushing down. I'll just give a little disclaimer. As you can see, I don't have a home office. I'm just in my living room, and my toddler is right there having a bath, so you'll probably hear and see her during this presentation. But I'm really excited to give a little talk about bioswales and other natural infrastructure and nature-based infrastructure and stormwater management, and then hopefully have a little discussion after. So to kick things off, I would like to start by acknowledging that here in Nova Scotia, we live and work on Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And with this acknowledgement, I'm offering it as a sign of respect and gratitude to the Mi'kmaq who have been managing this land for thousands of years. And Emma already talked a little bit about who we are at Coastal Action, but I'll just highlight our vision, which is a healthy environment for future generations. And our mission is to restore and protect the environment through research, education, and action. And just a little bit more about how we do the work that we do at Coastal Action. The space that we occupy in this provides scientific resource, and we work across sectors with government, academia, other NGOs, businesses, and private citizens. Okay, now we can dive in and get. I'm going to start off with a really brief primer on stormwater and the way that water moves through our landscape for context, because this is one of the really key pieces of green infrastructure. And I'm actually going to be talking about nature-based infrastructure or green infrastructure mostly through a stormwater lens, because that's one of the most widely used applications of this type of development. So in short, stormwater runoff is the water that does not get soaked back into the ground after a rain or other type of precipitation or a snowmelt. And specifically, it's the water that flows over impervious surfaces like roads and roofs straight into our storm drains, or in other cases, straight into our aquatic ecosystems. The stormwater that gets caught by our storm drains then enter combined sewer systems where it mixes with domestic sewage such as human waste and industrial wastewater. And then this water discharging into a natural water body. However, one thing to keep in mind about stormwater and the way it moves, a landscape that the wastewater treatment plant is overwhelmed, you can then open yourself up to getting raw sewage overflowing back through the stormwater drains or directly into your aquatic ecosystems, which is obviously bad for both people and our watersheds. And my cat is scratching, sorry. Hey. Okay, I'm here, I'm present. Okay, so here is a diagram showing how water moves through a natural ecosystem. And the main difference between ecosystem is that in a natural context where there isn't human development, there are a lot fewer impervious surfaces. So basically what happens is water starts in our lakes, rivers, and oceans, then it evaporates into clouds, and then it comes back to the ground through precipitation, where it infiltrates back into the ground, gets sucked up by plants, and then eventually gets stored back in our lakes, rivers, and oceans and as groundwater. So the way water moves through the landscape starts to look really different when you introduce human development like cities and all the impervious surfaces that go along with it. And the hard surfaces in the city basically turn the porous ground that you find in natural areas into a slide, preventing water from getting back into the ground and plants, and instead pushing it directly back into lakes, rivers, and oceans, or wastewater treatment plants. And this basically just translates to more and dirtier water being pushed towards our freshwater and saltwater ecosystems, and less water being reabsorbed as groundwater and being taken up by plants. And the main ways that this affects people is that it presents increased vulnerability to coastal and inland flooding. It affects the quality of our drinking water. It sets us up to be to experience more erosion and unstable shorelines. Our waterways stand the risk of getting polluted faster and our aquatic habitats getting damaged. And like a lot of other environmental issues, we can only expect these effects to get worse with climate change as our storms get worse and less predictable, and as there's more and more impermeable surfaces as we develop more land. So enter green infrastructure. In a nutshell, green infrastructure is a development that imitates natural ecological processes like the natural water cycle. And this type of development can be incorporated pretty easily into urban and suburban areas because there are so many different types of green infrastructure. Common goals of green infrastructure include stormwater management, improved biodiversity, and mitigation of the heat island effect. But one of the really cool things about green infrastructure is that based on how it's designed, it usually doesn't serve just one purpose, but it actually, sorry, my cat really wants attention. But it can actually benefit the area in a lot of different ways, which I will get into. So here are some of the most common examples of green infrastructure, many of which are probably already in your community. We've got rain gardens, green roofs, and permeable pavement are all very common and fairly easy to implement in cities because they can have a small footprint. And then there's also constructed and restored wetlands, which are less suitable for highly urbanized areas, but are really interesting to consider because they're super high impact. So not only do they filter and reabsorb stormwater, but they also prevent flash flooding from storm events. They can provide habitat for wildlife such as migratory birds and contribute positively to biodiversity, not in cities, usually. And then another kind that's not actually on the slide, but that I'd like to bring up is living shorelines, which is another type of green infrastructure generally used in coastal management, which basically just takes hard infrastructure like rock armoring and replaces it with soft infrastructure like a vegetated buffer or a natural coastal ecosystem like a salt marsh. And if you want to learn more about living shorelines, I'm just going to plug one of our really exciting projects. We're actually building one in the Mahone Bay Harbor starting this summer. So if you want to learn more about that, I encourage you to check out our website because I'm really excited about it. So you should. Okay, so I mentioned that there are a ton of different kinds of green or nature-based infrastructure, but they pretty much all have one thing in common, and that's they use plants to deliver ecosystem services. And plants do so much for us every day, like provide food and habitat for wildlife, sequester carbon, filter and slow the flow of water, and they also form the foundation of most food webs. And because green infrastructure typically uses plants, it also provides these same benefits. And I want to hone in on one specific type of green infrastructure, which is the bioswale. And it's a really interesting example. It's essentially a channel that's filled with plants that slows and filters water before it goes back into the waterways. And the reason it's so cool, in my opinion, is because it can be used in really highly developed areas and has a really high impact while having a low physical footprint. They can also be strategically planted to have lots of other benefits too, like supporting pollinators, providing shade, and improving biodiversity. And this is a bit more of a detailed view of how a bioswale works. So here you can see that this bioswale is relatively small, but would actually capture and filter stormwater runoff from this whole large parking lot area. And part of the water filtration element of bioswales and other green infrastructure is that it can actually filter out microplastics, which are tiny pieces of plastic that basically just end up in the environment and in our drinking water in our watersheds. And in fact, as part of one of our new stormwater and microplastics projects, where the climate change team is collaborating with the coastal and marine team, we're actually developing 2 bioswales in Bridgewater at the St. Joseph's Church. And one of our goals there is to measure exactly how much microplastics get absorbed and stopped by bioswales. So we'll be building 2 separate bioswales, and of course this is also to manage stormwater runoff going into the LaHave. But we're going to be working closely with the school that's right across the street, not only to deliver stormwater and microplastics educational programming, but actually engaging the students to be conducting water quality sampling with us. So we'll be measuring how much microplastics, how many particles of microplastics are in the water before going in and then after going through the bioswale, which is pretty exciting, I think. And again, if you want to learn more about that project, definitely check out our website because there's more information there. And speaking of which, this is how you can get in touch. Here's my email as well as our website, and you can definitely get in touch with us on social media too. And I'll also just say thank you to Environment and Climate Change Canada, who is funding the Bioswale, the Microplastics Bioswale project. And thank you all for attending. Hopefully we can have some questions and discussion.
Cool, thanks, Izzy. That was great. Becky, do you want to start with any questions or?
Sure. I'm going to give folks in the chat a little longer there, as I have a couple notes on our stream here saying that there's a lot of buffering happening, so they might be a couple minutes behind us still, so I'll give them time to catch up. But I definitely have questions. Bioswales in particular are one of my favorite landscape features, and I have a lot of questions about them. I also want to ask about your youth program, because we do similar stuff. I'd love to learn about your methods, but let's start with bioswales first, I guess. So there are probably quite a few aspiring or amateur or even professional botanists amongst the Nature Nova Scotia following, and probably quite a few watching. I'm particularly interested in what kinds of plants and plant assemblages make for good bioswales. Could you tell us a bit about, how you're picking your species and how you're making sure they're effective?
Yeah. So at Coastal Action, whenever we design a rain garden or a bioswale, we obviously focus on native plants because we want to develop a project that will not only do the job of stormwater management, but also benefit native pollinators and provide like a habitat island, usually in pretty urban areas. And the way that we choose our plants is pretty tailored to the site. So for example, if we're doing a full bioswale that has like a berm and it has areas that are wet all the time, wet some of the time, and dry most of the time, then we would choose native plants that can thrive in those kinds of settings. We also generally choose salt-tolerant plants because one of the great things about bioswales is that often they're designed to catch rainwater off or stormwater off roads, which are, have all kinds of different pollutants, including road salt. And I should say we use native and naturalized plants. So those are basically the criteria. And then often there's also like elements like color palettes and things like that.
Where do you find your plants? Because I know I've heard for other restoration projects, it can be hard to find sources of native plants that aren't trees in the Maritimes.
Baldwin Nursery in Falmouth has a really good selection. You right on the South Shore. I'm trying to think of their names, but Ocean View is one of them. Actually, they have good stuff.
Yeah, Baldwin's is good. We just picked up a couple shrubs and are planting to get some herbs from them for one of our projects. So shout out to Baldwin's.
Yeah, definitely. They're awesome.
I'm wondering about your youth program is monitoring plastics in swales, or hopefully not making it through swales.
Yeah.
How are those swales being designed, or are they being consciously designed to hold plastic, or are you just kind of seeing what makes it through at this point?
That element is being mostly handled by the coastal marine team. From my understanding, it's not going to affect our design that much. We just want to test how effective it is.
Cool. Do you know how do you actually monitor for the plastics when they come out?
Let's see. I don't really want to dig through my files because that would, I think, be more awkward than anything. But
no worries.
I'm so sorry, my side of things. But I can't wait to, be there and learn more about it myself, to be honest. I'm usually more on the planting side.
Oh, don't worry, I have lots of plant questions.
Great, hit me.
So I'm curious about salt tolerance too. So we know, there are lots of wetland grasses that make for great restoration projects, but are there any surprise plants that you're using that have really high salt tolerance?
Some plants are more salt tolerant than I would think they are. Like, for example, we plant commonly sweet pepper bush and blue flag iris. And in my mind, blue flag iris, because it's so beautiful and showy, would not do well in a challenging environment like that. But we've actually had really good luck. And I guess one of the great things about working with native plants is that a lot of native Nova Scotia plants just naturally have high salt tolerance because so much of this province is coastal.
Yeah, handy.
How have you found working with partners in this project? So, for example, municipalities or schools, have you found that people are generally receptive to these types of projects?
For the most part, yes. I think there is a mental barrier sometimes. I think sometimes it's a challenge for people to see how plants and flooding relate to each other. And sometimes we kind of have to get into the nitty-gritty of what effects are actually how these things are actually affecting our freshwater ecosystems and things like that. But generally the people that we work with are super enthusiastic, especially towns, if they have a site that isn't being used, or there's drainage issues or things like that, they're generally really excited. And one of the things that I find most convenient about working with bioswales and other types of natural or nature-based infrastructure is that piece where they can be used for so many different things. So, a rain garden can also be a beautification project. It can also be a wildlife refuge. It can also be a tourist attraction. So that's really handy. We can pitch it so many different ways depending on who the partner is and what their best interests are.
How do costs compare in projects like this? So if you, or maybe even concerned landowners, approach the city and say, this is a really wet area, we'd like you to clean up, how would the cost installing a bioswale compare to some other hard structure that would be more normal maybe for a lot of cities?
Well, it really depends because there are so many different types of green infrastructure. You can kind of tailor the project to a budget. So you can do something really simple like a rain garden where you just plant plants that will soak up the water in a wet area, or you can do something really complex like a living shoreline or a bioswale where you're involving engineers, you're getting provincial and federal permits, all these different things. So it's a huge range. But really, one of the main differences between nature-based infrastructure or soft infrastructure and hard infrastructure is that the cost for hard infrastructure is a really big cost up front, and then maintenance long term, and then eventually another really big cost of replacing it. Whereas nature-based infrastructure, if done correctly, is a relatively large cost up front, but then it's a self-sustaining system. So it requires theoretically, when done right, it requires less maintenance long term. And once it's established and healthy, it will actually grow instead of deteriorate. So that's kind of how the costs shake out.
Cool.
You kind of spoke to this a little bit at the beginning about the need for green infrastructure in more developed places like cities, but how, I don't even know how to frame this question, but what is your messaging like around the need to continue to protect existing natural areas that naturally provide the functions of green infrastructure and arguably more effective than anything that we could build, like natural, whatever the analog of a natural bioswale is, I guess a wetland or a ditch or something like that, a natural wetland. But how do you balance that, I guess, advocating for that natural area protection, and how does building green infrastructure fit into that messaging?
So in my opinion, there's no replacement for the real thing. A constructed wetland is possibly never going to work as well as a naturally occurring wetland. So conservation is like really important. I mean, especially in such a coastal province, the level of protection that we get from naturally occurring salt marshes, the ones that are left at least, you know, is invaluable. Like we just can't replace that. And it's so much less expensive to leave a wetland as it is rather than develop over it and then try to make up for it somewhere else. Because, you know, transportation and infrastructure renewal will actually pay for projects where you're constructing and renewing wetlands, but that's a really big effort. So I think that conservation and green infrastructure play into each other a lot. Like they're kind of trying to achieve the same things from like a climate change perspective. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess I kind of think of it as like there are ways to replace the functions that have been lost. And like you said, it can be hard in densely populated urban areas to just build a wetland, or like, to use an example from Halifax, most of the interior of the peninsula, particularly say like the Halifax Commons, used to be a wetland area, and obviously we're not going to replace maybe any of that as wetlands in our lifetime. But we can maybe replace some of those wetland functions.
Yeah,
could be a way to do that.
I think in highly developed urban areas, a lot of the time, it's exactly like you said, like we're not going to replace that with green infrastructure. However, I do think that there is a place for damage control and for improving existing systems and taking pressure off like sewage treatment. And, you know, I think it would actually help like curb erosion and stuff around coastlines. So, and like, especially here in Halifax, there are so many really cool examples, like, you know, green roofs on the library and like all these different stormwater catchment systems. Like I'm thinking of the Seaport Market, where they have like, I think pretty sophisticated stormwater catchment systems, and they actually use that in their plumbing for their gray water and stuff. And anyways, I don't think it's a replacement, but you know, I think it helps.
The Commons could probably use a nice bioswale now that I'm thinking about it. I walk across there so often. I always think, man, this is a lot of lawn.
Yeah, grass is not very efficient for reabsorbing water.
Mm-hmm. Where are some examples, Izzy, or maybe you have some examples too, Emma, where folks could go see some of these features? So I mean, if you're not in Halifax, you're not in Lunenburg, what's an example folks could have a look at?
Outside of Halifax and Lunenburg?
Well, maybe that's a good enough question in itself. We need more of them, I guess.
Yeah, there are a couple in Bridgewater. There are 2 different bioswales at the Bridgewater NSCC campus. I don't know, do you know of any outside of those hubs, Emma?
Yeah, I mean, I can think of a few more constructed wetland systems around stormwater or wastewater treatment that we've helped build in, like, for example, the community marsh in Annapolis Royal, it was built to help with stormwater or wastewater treatment. There's a few in Moncton around stormwater management, but definitely sounds like we need more around the province.
I agree. I have a vested interest, though.
Are either of you aware of any infrastructure projects like the ones we've been talking about that have been used as compensation development or something similar?
We're working on that for our Living Shorelines project.
Yeah. I would think the way that the wetland policy, it would be tough for some green infrastructure, like the smaller ones like a rain garden or bioswale, to work as compensation, just because they might not replace enough of the wetland functions as a wetland or more constructed wetland or a living shoreline would.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible that something like a naturalized stormwater pond could be used as compensation. There aren't very many in Nova Scotia, if any, but I can be corrected on that. So it probably just hasn't been done yet. But I think that, so with the wetland conservation policy, the goal is to prevent net loss of wetlands on a provincial scale. But that often leads to localized loss where it's hard to restore wetlands, for example, in Halifax or other areas like Cape Breton, where it's hard to find good wetland restoration sites. So maybe using a larger suite of tools, including green infrastructure, constructed wetlands, living shorelines, to replace some of those wetland functions on a more localized scale could be an option in the future. But that would be that those decisions are made by the people who regulate the wetland policy. So Nova Scotia Environment.
Yeah, a lot of pieces there. Yeah, it'd be neat though if there was like a whole bunch of bioswales in Halifax in the next couple years, and then maybe cumulatively those could be used as a, I don't know, like 10-year bioswale plan kind of compensation project would be interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, aside from public projects, it's totally feasible for people to do this on private land too. I just wanted to show this book that I have that I refer to a lot. I don't know if it's backwards, but it's Creating Rain Gardens. And it basically, like, I think when I think about rain gardens versus bioswales, I think of rain gardens as like a fairly simple structure, and bioswales as more complicated and kind of needing more like engineering. But it's totally feasible for people to manage stormwater on their own lands, and help with that kind of thing. So the resources are out there. People can do it on their own dime and on their own time, which I know is not always that interesting, but I have a funny feeling that the people attending this talk are maybe biased one way.
Oh, I think they'd be interested for sure. We'll make sure that we share some resources for folks. I have plans for my own little rain garden, so I'm definitely interested.
That's exciting. I can lend you this book if you want.
Amazing. How do you find uptake is, when you're working with representatives from cities or if it's private landowners? Yeah, what are the main barriers to getting these projects in the ground, and who's really ready to adopt them?
Generally, I find the barriers are space, people power, and money. You need to kind of have all three of those for those projects to be really successful on public lands, because it should be said that with a lot of nature-based infrastructure, it does require, like, if it's going to look a certain way, it's going to need to be tended. So for example, when it's on public lands, you do need to consult with like maintenance personnel and like develop plans. So that can kind of be a place where people get caught up and they might say, this sounds like more work than it's worth. But when we're doing our jobs right, we can kind of develop a plan that works for everybody and plan it specifically so that it's not a burden. But the uptake I find is really good. Like, I think that people are I think there's a trend of people thinking more and more about things like flash flooding and stormwater management in different ways. And I think that as more and more examples crop up, people are going to become more used to the idea that, like, oh, plants can actually just help us live a more pleasant and a more environmentally sustainable life in the city.
We found too that so we've worked with communities across, more so in the prairies and out west, to build naturalized stormwater ponds in new subdivision developments, for example, in Winnipeg and I think some cities in Alberta. And we found that developers are really keen on them because they actually tend to increase the property values of the houses when they have this, what turns out to be a really nice looking marsh pond in their neighborhood instead of the more traditional dry stormwater pond, which is usually just like a gravel pit that will get wet when it rains. Or the pond that we built in Moncton is very popular, and there's a walking trail around it, and all the residents love it. So a lot of developers are starting to ask for those features as well. So it's like you said earlier, Izzy, one of the benefits of green infrastructure is that there's so many different angles as to how you can sell them, I guess, in terms of environmental services and ecosystem services, but also the financial side of it too, and benefits, both in terms of less costs in the long term, but also sometimes more money in the short and medium and long term too. I know that's weird maybe to think about sometimes as biologists, but sometimes you just have to sell these things any way that you can to as many people as possible.
Yeah.
And are you aware of any sites in Halifax that would really benefit maybe from some of these projects? I was thinking, when you guys were talking about like cultural uptake, and I was thinking Halifax has so many different kinds of neighborhoods, some with already really great existing natural infrastructure and not intentional, but and others that have none at all. And I know your work kind of overlaps with that subject. So what do you guys think about, is there anywhere in Halifax where you're like, okay, we really need like a pond here, we need a bioswale here?
I don't know. To be honest, we haven't really delved in at that level of detail yet. But there's a lot of growth happening in Halifax, and there's still a lot of development happening in greenfield development, so new areas that are being built upon. So I guess my first priority would be to, like we kind of talked about earlier, protect as many of those existing natural features as possible, especially in those newly built areas. But then maybe in terms of looking for green infrastructure opportunities, as we talked about, going and looking at these older areas that have a lot of those historical features lost, like on the peninsula, or I don't know, Lower Sackville, places like that, where there is a lot of flooding, and where those functions around water storage are really important.
Yeah, I was recently looking at the Sackville River floodplain map, and excuse me, almost the entire thing is developed with residential lots. So that's kind of a red flag. I would like to see a lot more nature-based infrastructure around like the coastal protection side of things around Halifax, because we are a peninsula, so obviously we have a lot of coastline, and the vast majority of it is just protected with rock armoring. So in my mind, there's a lot of potential there.
Infrastructure look like, Izzy, if we're explaining to folks, we don't want rocks on the shoreline, what should we be showing them?
Basically wetlands. So I'll just use the living shoreline. I'll say that the living shoreline model hasn't been used that much in Atlantic Canada yet, which is why we're folding in a lot of research into our project to see how well it actually works and how we can improve the methodology based on this climate. But basically wetlands. So for ours in Mahone Bay, essentially what we're doing is we are removing the rock armoring. So the rock armoring goes up about like 10 feet off the seafloor. So we're going to be removing that and then actually grading the land 20 meters out and then creating rock sills out there. So the rock sills will break the wave energy as it comes over. And then basically all that area that was graded, we're going to essentially just construct a salt marsh. And then there's also going to be pocket beaches to ensure like healthy sediment movement and healthy inflow outflow so that the salt marsh can establish. So yeah, the short answer is wetlands.
Yeah. Good stuff. Yeah, it's hard to explain to folks, I think. I mean, if you're not familiar with living shorelines, with the shorelines, with the difference there is, because it's probably easy to think, well, like these rocks are going to be super strong and protect me from storm surges, but a wetland, as meek as they look, does a lot better. So
yeah,
cool stuff. Where could we direct folks if they want to learn more about coastal infrastructure, living shorelines?
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't say our website. But there are a lot of really cool resources out there. One website that I was just looking at, oh shoot, I meant to have this open. It's it's maybe called the Salt Marsh Experiment. Sorry, I'm just going to Google frantically. Okay, I can't find it. Anyways, there are a lot of really great organizations around here that are doing this kind of work and this research. So there's us, Coastal Action. Transcoastal Adaptations is also a really cool one. They're based out of SMU, and they're actually one of our project partners for the Living Shoreline project. And they're the ones who are heading up the research side of things. So if you want to know more about that specific project, definitely keep an eye there. They also do a lot of work with managed dike realignment projects. So definitely check them out. The work they're doing is really cool. CB West is very interesting too. Yeah, those are the main ones in Nova Scotia that I can think of. Unless I feel like I'm missing some. Emma, I'm looking at you. I mean, Ducks does a lot of conservation work also.
Yeah, we do salt marsh naturalization and restoration, but we haven't done as much specifically living shorelines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's a good point. There's quite a bit of overlap between infrastructure projects, which are maybe a little more man-made, and then kind of like rewilding projects. And the dike openings are really good examples of that. We'll make sure afterwards, both in the description for the video and to our general Facebook page, we'll share all of those resources we've gone over, maybe also some examples of where folks have done some of these projects. Some of the dike openings in the valley are really impressive, and some of them were just essentially breaking down the artificial wall. So, cool stuff. Well, guys, I don't see any questions in our chat here, and that might...
it's kind of amazing with...
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Wetlands. I was just going to say, it is kind of amazing with salt marsh restoration how when you allow the salt water to come back onto the land, it really takes care of the rest of it itself. And
yeah, for our Living Shoreline project, I'm hesitant to even call it constructing a wetland, because what we're doing is we're infilling the area on a grade and then exposing it to normal tides, and then we're like strategically planting native salt marsh grasses in like small clumps and then just letting nature take its course.
That's convenient and keeps your budget down.
Yeah.
Life finds a way. Wonder if Jeff Goldblum's...
If only.
I don't have any questions in our chat here, guys. I think that's because, and I'm also seeing our our viewers come and go. I think that's probably because we've got a lot of buffering tonight, so this might have to be one of the ones that just ends up recorded and on YouTube. But yeah, Emma, did you have any other questions or thoughts we could run through before wrapping up here? We don't keep you too long, Izzy. I know you just are in the middle of finishing up a bath.
Oh, my partner's doing that. Don't worry.
Oh, excellent.
This is like a perfect excuse not to do bedtime.
No, I don't think I have any other questions, but yeah, I really enjoyed our discussion on green infrastructure and wetlands, and I think the work that you guys are doing is really great. Really
Thank you.
interesting stuff.
Yeah,
Thank you
same.
for inviting me to take part in this discussion. It was really fun.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Yeah, so we'll make sure, folks, those of you who have hung on through the buffering, we'll make sure that all the things that we've mentioned here are linked to the main presentation, which will be up on YouTube within the next hour or so after we go through the regular edits, and to the Nature Nova Scotia Facebook page. So if you're wondering about how to make your own rain garden, or if you're interested in pressuring your city to put in a bioswale in an area where you're always getting your feet wet, we'll have those resources there for you. We're also going to have Izzy's contact up there. We'll link Coastal Action's website and lots of stuff for you. So we'll let you go. Have a great night, and we'll see you in a month. Exactly a month. On the first Tuesday of next month, when we are... I can't remember what subject it is. It's not Barrens, that's the one after. Maybe we don't have that one confirmed yet, Emma.
Is it spring flowers?
I think that was our plan. I can't remember if we had that one confirmed anyway. Well, we'll be talking about something in a month. Maybe flowers, maybe something else. We'll see you guys then. All right. Bye. All right.